Well, hey there guys, and welcome back. On this week's show, we're talking about the router table starter pin. Now, in some of my more recent shows, I have been using the router table a little more. And during those segments, I have stressed the importance of a router pin. And I don't know if that's what sparked it or not, but I have been absolutely pummeled with emails and questions and comments regarding the router pin, how to use one, how to install it, etc., etc., etc. And I'm kind of surprised at the number of people that really don't have common knowledge about the starter pin. They have the actual router table, they have the pin, but no clue how to use it. So I backed up a little bit and went through some of my router manuals, and I was actually shocked that nowhere in any of those manuals, other than showing you how to install this thing, does it show you how to use it. So that's what we're going to do today. We're going to head over to the router table. I don't know how long this show is going to go, but we're going to head over to the router table, install this router pin, and I'm going to show you how to use it and kind of talk a little bit about it, and hopefully it'll clear some stuff up for you. So let's head over to the router table. Well, first off, what is a starter pin? And a router starter pin looks like this. And what this does is this provides you with a positive reference and a guide and a support to bring your stock on smaller and medium pieces into your router bit. Now, I'm not talking about router bits like this. This is an upcut spiral bit. This is not going to ever be used with a starter pin. You would use this router bit with a fence setup or that sort of thing, or a coping sled. But this one here will never be used with a starter pin. And in fact, a bit that excels for the starter pin and what it's meant to be used for is a bit like this. And that would be a bearing guided bit. Now guys, the installation of the starter pin, every router table or most router tables have somewhere on here either a tight fitting friction fit hole to place your router pin in or a threaded hole. With mine, the Jessom table, it's a threaded hole, and there's one here and there's one on this side, so you can take your pick, right or left, depending on how you're feeding your work. So I'm going to place it here, and it's just done, installed. This is why I really don't understand why people don't use these things, because they are so simple to install and so simple to use. But why do we use them? Well, let me show you. Let me just pretend here. I'm not going to turn the router on, but I'm going to remove our pin here and show you without the pin. I'm not going to try to duplicate a kickback here, guys. Far too dangerous. But let me just show you what happens. The problem is that in order to do, let's say in this case, a round over, you need to get this stock tight up against the bearing. Well, during that time, especially on end grain, there's a lot of potential for this bit to grab this corner and rip it out of your hands. In fact, sometimes it can even rip it and spin it around the opposite side, which now, with the bit turning counterclockwise, I guess, looking down on it, it will now pull this piece around, and it has the potential to pull your fingers in with it if you're not using push pads, etc. So how do you get your piece in to start it? Well, that's where the starter pin comes in, and that is your pivot point. So what you want to do is you start it up against your starter pin, and you want to pivot your piece into the router bit, and you've got complete control here now on this pivot point. As you're pivoting this piece, the router bit is spinning, and it's cutting away that excess material to allow you to get this corner into your bearing. Once you get it safely into the bearing, then you can follow through with the cut. Once this bearing is in contact with your stock, there's no longer a need to have it up against the pivot pin or the starter pin, because at that point in time, you can now use the bearing as your support. But at no point here should you be without support, and without that starter pin, trying to get it into the bearing to get that support, you are freehand routing, which is a very dangerous thing to do. So let me get a couple of push blocks here and let me demonstrate how you can use your starter pin, and in this case just some plywood. We're going to put this round over onto our piece of plywood. So I'm just going to show you at this close angle here how to do it, and then I'll give you a view from above so you can get a much better view of the action of the pivot. So let me just start this up, and I want to say here that pay attention to the diameter of your router bit. This one here is 1.5 inches in diameter. So for my liking, I'm not going over 18,000 RPM. So if you have an adjustable router, pay attention to what kind of RPM you're putting out, because that can cause you some dangerous situations as well. So let me show you how to do this here. And perfectly controlled, perfectly supported. There was never a time that this had the chance to be grabbed by the bit. So let me show you the overhead view of this. So here we're going to place our stock tight up against our starter pin, and then slowly and carefully rotate it in towards the router bit, but more specifically towards the center of the router bit's guide bearing. Once you get contact with that guide bearing, you can separate your piece from the guide pin and run it through for your round over. But at no point in time now, while we're routing, is the piece or the piece of stock ever free floating. It is always supported either by the pin or by the bearing, but at least there is support which will at least prevent or assist to prevent any kind of grabbing or any kind of kickback. And by doing that, you can get yourself some safe results, even if you're cutting on the end grain. Let's try the end grain here and I'll show you how that's going to work. Same process, guys. It's all a matter of pivoting from our starter pin. And even on a short piece like this, bringing it into the router is 100% safe because of the starter pin. If you remove that starter pin, can you imagine how unsafe or how unsupported or how dangerous this is here, trying to get this into the bearing with nothing to support it. It doesn't take much on that corner for the bit to grab and spin that out of the way. Catastrophic, guys, if your hands are anywhere near it. The machine has a lot of power and can really pull that stock through. You really don't have the reaction time, nor do you have the strength to overpower a bit of this size, let alone if you are using something like 3-inch, like say raised panels style bit, where it's a lot of material being removed. You really need the starter pin. But what if you don't have one? What if your router table is homemade? What if you bought it secondhand and you don't have one? Well, let me show you what you can do for that. So I've measured my starter pin and measured the threads, and mine happens to be 1/4 threads. So what I have is some UHMW plastic. This is just a scrap offcut. I usually have some of this kicking around in the shop. And I've cut off a length 3/4 of an inch. I've drilled a 1/4 inch diameter hole through the middle, and I've mounted it between centers on a pen mandrel. And I'm going to turn this round. I actually have a couple pen bushings here, and I'm going to make it the same size as those pen bushings. So let me get this turned around, and I'll show you what to do with it from there. Every once in a while turning UHMW, guys, get rid of this stuff. This stuff is a good way to wrap around your fingers and suck you into that spindle. So we'll get it trimmed up. We're almost there, actually. That was real-time turning, and honest to goodness, it doesn't take long to turn down UHMW plastic. I love this stuff, but it does have a tendency to string like this. All right, let's get her finished up. All right, so let's get this out of the lathe and off the pen mandrel, and we'll take this over to the router table. And the other thing you're going to need is a 1/4 20 by 1 inch long bolt. Okay, so here we have our UHMW turning, and we can just place a 1/4 20 bolt right through that, and then we're going to place it right here and install it in place of our starter pin. Guys, look at that. You have created your own starter pin. Honest to goodness, I created this in about 5 minutes, and it is just as rock solid as what this steel one is. This will serve you well without a doubt. Honest to goodness, if you don't have one or you bought your router table secondhand, it didn't come with the starter pin, this took 5 minutes. Make one. You will be happy that you did. And although you do need a screwdriver to install it, who cares? You have an amazing starter pin that will serve you well. If you want, you can even just install it by hand like that. You don't necessarily need the screwdriver, but better to be looking at it than looking for it. So guys, you know, it doesn't even have to be UHMW plastic. It can be anything. You can load this thing up with washers from top to bottom as long as they're the proper size for the bolt and they're not shifting around to give you good support. You could use a piece of hardwood dowel and turn it to fit over top of the bolt to give you the support. You can use resin. You can do whatever you have to. Heck, guys, 3D print one. If you have a 3D printer, print this whole thing, do it with 100% fill so that there's no gaps to make it more sturdy, with your 1/4 inch hole in the middle and your outer dimensions 3/4 of an inch long. It's a fast print. It takes no filament. I would, like I said, I would do 100% fill so that it's a solid piece of ABS or whatever it is that you're using in your 3D printer. But there's no excuse not to have one, guys. And you saw how easy it is to use and how controlled that routing can be. So guys, get yourself a starter pin. And there you have it. Using a starter pin on your router table. Guys, as I said earlier, I am absolutely shocked at the number of people that have no clue how to use the safety pin, or the starter pin rather, on their router tables. It's such a simple device. It is so quick, so easy, whether it be shop made or whether it be store bought or commercially available. It's the most simple device in the world, and it gives so much support to your routed piece. Now guys, if you're routing something larger, like say a panel or a larger board, you don't really need the starter pin. The chances of the bit grabbing that larger board and ripping it or pulling it are a lot less. The board outweighs the force of the bit. Can you still use the router starter pin? Of course you can. There's nothing wrong with that. But really the odds of something happening with a larger panel are a lot slimmer than with the smaller or medium pieces. With the smaller or medium pieces, I guarantee you want to use a starter pin. Especially if you're kind of on the end grain. That end grain can really be a problem because it really wants to grab. It's a much tougher cut for the router bit. It's a much tougher slice because, of course, it's cutting the end grain. Don't believe me? Try any tool cutting end grain. Try it with a block plane and see how well it does. Because essentially all you're really doing with a router bit is you're using a plane over and over and over and over again as that bit rotates to cut the end grain. It's a tough cut. It's hard on the machinery and it really wants to grab. But the support of the starter pin will hopefully prevent that grab. Now guys, starter pins, just like anything else, just like riving knives or splitters, they are not 100% foolproof. There is still the possibility that it could grab and kick back. And my best solution, or my best suggestion, I should say, to anyone in any situation with any tool, if that tool wants the piece of wood, if it wants to take it from you, let it have it. Let it have it. Just let go. Don't even try to fight it. You don't want to get into a situation where your hands are being pulled in with that piece of wood. Whether it be a sander, whether it be the router table, whether it be the plane, whether it be the table saw, the oscillating drum, it doesn't matter. If the tool wants that piece of board, let it go. Let it have it. Better for the board to get messed up than to have these get messed up. So, but either way, I'm telling you from fact and from experience and from a lot of years experience, the starter pin will go a long way to making sure that the kickback doesn't happen, or at least you've got the best chances of it not happening. So guys, if you don't already have one, or if you don't know where it is, or if you know where it is and you just don't use it, you're taking your chances. Start using your starter pin, guys. Guys, I want to thank you so much for tuning in. I want to thank you for all the questions and comments that you've been sending me. You know, producing 2 shows a week can become one of those things where it gets harder and harder to come up with ideas for shows. It gets harder to know what you guys want to see. And when I get comments about starter pins and questions, and so many of them, that's a clear indication for me that it's time to produce a show on how to use it and what exactly it's for. So I want to thank you so much for that. If you haven't already, please consider liking and subscribing to the channel. You click the bell and then you're not going to miss the notifications of future episodes of the program. Guys, I want to thank you so much for tuning in. I want to thank you again for your comments. I hope that you're going to get that starter pin out of its storage, find it and start using it. But more importantly, guys, I hope you're going to join me again next week when I bring you yet another Alternative Tuesdays.